Well, welcome everybody. My name is Lindsay Zilly, and I'm the Director of Professional Learning for Illinois Digital Educators Alliance. So glad that you're here with us today for this most important topic of conversation. Please do utilize that chat. We'll be monitoring it frequently. So if you have questions, thoughts, concerns of any kind, go ahead and post there. You may have your camera off or on, whichever you feel more comfortable doing, but please do stay muted while our panel is chatting right now. If there are questions that we need to save to the end, we'll answer those as well. In addition, we will also make sure we provide you with a link for your professional development hour in the chat. And if you have trouble accessing it in any capacity, we'll make sure we stay on. Both myself and Whitney from IDEA will be able to walk you through that process if needed. But without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to one of my good friends from the Nora Project, Katie, who is going to enlighten us with a great many things, I'm sure, today. So thank you so much for being here today, Katie.
Thanks, Lindsay. We're really excited to be here. My name is Katie Fatella. I use pronouns she, her. I'm a white woman. I have long brown hair, a little bit past my shoulders. I'm wearing a black t-shirt. I have red glasses and a headset, and I'm sitting in front of a virtual background that's pink and purple and ethereal looking. I am the Chief Program Officer at the Nora Project, and we are a nonprofit organization with a mission to promote disability inclusion by empowering educators and engaging students and communities. And so for us, this means providing in-depth training for educators and community members on disability studies and best practices that help folks create spaces that make every participant feel a sense of belonging. We also offer social emotional learning curriculum with a focus on empathy education and disability studies. And our programs really give teachers the language, the tools, and the resources to help develop in their students what we call an ability inclusive mindset. So we would love to connect with you after the presentation if you have any interest in exploring either our training opportunities or our curricular programs. I'm going to share a document in the chat, and Lindsay will actually drop that for you, with mine and Jordyn's contact information and a bit of information about the Nora Project that you can take with you and hopefully share with your colleagues. So before we begin today, I want to let everyone know again that live captioning is available and can be turned on by selecting the closed captioning icon on your Zoom toolbar if you're joining us via Zoom. If there's any activity in the chat today, we will pause and read those contributions aloud in an effort to honor all types of communication. We are really excited to bring this conversation to you today, and we're hoping that it will lead you to do some reflection for yourself on your own experience teaching and learning in so-called inclusive spaces. And I'm going to be moderating today's panel, and I'm going to hand it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. And I'd like to start with Jordyn and then have John and then Alex introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. I'm so grateful to be joining this panel today. I'm Jordyn Zimmerman, pronouns she, her, and I'm the Director of Professional Development with the Nora Project. I am a white woman with wavy brown hair. I am wearing a black shirt with white text and sitting in front of wood blinds and a bookshelf. I communicate using assistive technology. For me, this looks like an iPad with a communication application where I type letter by letter to make words and phrases, which are then spoken aloud. While I have pre-programmed much of the content for today's panel, I invite you to consider the beautiful pauses of silence that occur when myself or others who use communication supports to share are conversing with others in everyday life.
Thanks, Jordyn. All right, John?
I'm John Gensic. I'm a science teacher and STEM Academy leader at Penn High School that has over 3,400 students, a public school in near South Bend, Indiana. I think I'm wearing a kind of a plaid striped blue and white shirt, wearing a tie in the lower level of my house with some pictures of my family in the background. I have 4 kids and teach kids that are just a little bit older than my own kids right now. I've worked with the Nora Project. I think this is my 2nd year, maybe even the 3rd year, it feels like. time's going by quick right now. And yeah, we've been collaborating on a sympathy project through the Nora Project, but also we're going to co-teaching other inclusive efforts in our own schools. And I've helped to pioneer some of the work, but then also encourage some of the work in our schools. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Thanks, John. Alex?
Hi, I'm Alex Parker. I'm a cisgender male who uses pronouns he, him. I have brown skin. I have brown eyes, black hair. I'm wearing a light blue plaid shirt, no ties, so John definitely outdid me in this scenario with the classiness of his dress. I'm currently in my 4th grade classroom as I'm a 4th grade teacher, and I'm also a doctoral student at the School of Education at Johns Hopkins University. And I'm a project leader for both the Storyteller Project and Sympathy Club for the Nora Project. And in addition to that, I've done some curriculum creation and consultation for the organization as well.
Welcome, all of you. Thank you so much for being on this panel. We have 3 sort of prepared questions, and then we'll open it up to folks to share any questions that you have as they come up. So the first question I'd like to pose to Jordyn first. Jordyn, how would you define inclusion in schools?
First, I'd say that inclusion is not something you do, but rather is something you really have to believe. Inclusion also isn't something that someone can designate within a space, but rather when a space is inclusive, it expands into a sense of belonging for the person or group. Often, when we name something inclusive, it isn't because when something is actually inclusive and for everyone, it just is. Secondly, to me, inclusion means everyone learning and engaging together. It doesn't necessarily mean everyone is doing the same algebraic problem, but everyone is held to the same challenging expectations and belief that they can succeed. This means that curriculum modifications are incorporated to allow all students to learn side by side, and every student has the opportunity to fail. If we really think about this, if students aren't given the opportunity to fail together, there's no true sense of shared accomplishment.
Thanks, Jordyn. John and Alex, go ahead.
I agree with what Jordyn said. I would say that in my role, I work with different definitions of inclusion based on like which teachers I'm talking to, because I think about inclusion on a continuum of the ideal that Jordyn just expressed, but then I know where teachers are at in their minds, or maybe even administrators I work with are in their minds. So like, I think about like what their experience is currently and think about what's a little bit more inclusive than what they have right now. And do I try to express the type of vision that Jordyn just expressed in terms of people being held to different yet high expectations and challenges to succeed together? Yes. But is that how I communicate to different people at different times? Maybe not, because some of the people I work with are kind of don't know what it all takes to get to that point, so they don't think that it's possible. Yeah, it's in our building, we have students in a certain hallway and in certain classrooms. And I think that all of these are kind of definitions that people use for inclusion in our own building. But to be in the same room at the same time, intermixed in different groups, is even more in alignment with what Jordyn had said. So yeah, it moves based on who I'm with, but I agree with what Jordyn said.
Yeah, for me, definitely, as I was thinking about what as I've processed this question, a lot of what Jordyn had to say, I think I was definitely conceptualizing. And John, to your point too, I think a lot of it is, it feels like it's it's a moving target, and it also feels a lot like it's a continuum, that people are kind of entering the work at different places. And I think the end goal is absolutely kind of operationalizing what Jordyn has described syntactically and semantically. But I think you're right, we kind of have to get people there, through different avenues, and it might take people longer to get there. But I think that is kind of the ideal point at the end. I think for me, inclusion in schools would probably have to be the idea of individuals in a school being treated equitably as a means to provide high quality education and socialization and educational opportunities. And I think I'm using the word equitably really intentionally as opposed to using the word equality. And I do that just because I think that equality and inclusion isn't necessarily the ideal. Because I think when you take on that sense of equity, you really get to the idea of people being supported with what they need in order for them to succeed instead of treating everyone the same. And so I think that's kind of a paradigm shift that also has to occur here, is that we just can't, have everyone exist in the same space and say that that's a definition of inclusion, but trying to make sure that people can get what they need to, again, have those high standards and achieve what they need, but they might need a different thing to get there.
Yeah, I think probably it's a very common experience across schools, across states, across, even countries, we're finding as we, work with folks in other countries as well, that there is a continuum of what people think inclusion is. But I think that we all agree that there is an ideal, and that ideal is not, while it might sound radical, if you are at, the beginning of your journey in thinking about creating truly inclusive spaces. And as Jordyn said, if it is truly inclusive, we shouldn't have to say it. We shouldn't have to name it as inclusive. It might sound radical, but it's not. It really is just providing everyone with their civil rights and creating a space where everyone feels a strong sense of belonging. Did anyone else want to say anything else on this topic?
I think Katie said something interesting too about the idea of it like almost theoretically feeling radical. And I think that's so telling, just because it's like that's definitely indicative of the fact that there is still a ways to go. That the idea of something that ideally makes a lot of sense in terms of like human rights, basically, it makes a lot of sense. But to some people, that's a big stretch away from what we usually do. And it's like, yeah, that means that we've got to do a lot more. So I think you saying that, I think resonated with me.
Yeah.
Both positively and negatively.
Right. One of the things that I have in over years of meeting with and sharing about the Nora Project with administrators and teachers is one of the responses that I hear often is, oh, we already do inclusion. What does that mean? What is that? If that phrase comes out of your mouth, you're not doing it. You're not, flat out, you're not doing it. And as Jordyn put so beautifully, like inclusion is a belief system. It's a mindset, and it's an approach to creating spaces where everyone has what they need to be successful. So it's just so interesting when I hear that from people that, like you said, Alex, it's just that we have a long way to go, a lot of hearts and minds to change, and a lot of education to do to support people in moving towards an understanding that will support that ideal version of inclusion.
Yeah, to piggyback off of the comment that was just in the chat, not even sure what doing inclusion means. That I think in a lot of these conversations with people is, yeah, what do you mean by you're doing inclusion, right? Like having them describe out loud, and sometimes unravels where they're at, but then also it's that question gets at the mindset part of it, right? It gets at the thinking part of it. That so more to come on that. Yeah.
And that made me think, John, about how sometimes programs in districts are designed to serve students with disabilities, and they're segregated classrooms or programs, and they're called inclusion classrooms. So if we really think about that, the segregated classroom is being called the inclusion classroom. So there's a lot of things that if we interrogate our understanding of the word, begin to feel a little bit backwards.
Yeah,
or a lot backwards.
I think the root of that is that I was just in a conversation with exceptional education teachers who have been in exceptional education for 30 some years. So like the fact that classroom is in the building is inclusion relative to that past of being in a separate, under a separate roof.
Mhm.
So that's why I say, like, it's my working definition of inclusion has to be based on the person I'm talking to. Otherwise, it's like we are talking about two different things and thinking we're talking about the same thing. So like a good amount of listening has to happen for me to define inclusion in the conversation I'm having. Yeah.
Jordyn, did you? Oh, okay. Okay, so I think that sort of moves us nicely into the next question, which I'd like to pose to John first, which is, what did you used to think about inclusion, and what do you know now? Oh, actually, John, can I pause for just 1 second? I'm going to read what's in the chat. Jordyn shared, I'm not even sure what doing inclusion means. Teresa shared, I was just going to say that quote unquote inclusion for some teachers means this combining of students with individualist IEP plans with quote unquote gen ed, which is terribly old. Yes. Just combining students in the same room is not inclusion. It's putting kids in the same room. Thanks, Teresa. John, go ahead.
So what did I used to think and what I now think? I thought in an academic space that like inclusion was pretty unattainable, especially like at the high school level in science classes. Now I picture it being more doable, and especially through the idea of creative intentional planning to make those things happen. Into creative intentional planning flows from the belief that accessible and inclusive spaces are better and more rich, right? So we have a co-taught biology class that is working towards being inclusive, and I asked for that teacher's view of how it's going, because I view that as my own current understanding of disability inclusion. And he said that the tone of the class has changed, right? So many honor students who at the beginning of the year wouldn't demonstrate patience for students who are off diploma track or applied students have become, those honor students have become more patient and also more active cheerleaders for the success of all the students. So, right, where a typical honor student is pretty like academic focused, I need to get this test done, I need to study for my stuff. Like the culture of that classroom has changed as a result of having a more inclusive design and having students in the same space, but intentionally in the same space and planned for. We've not seen any negative in terms of the difference for honors performance, and there might be even higher performance understanding than what other honors classes have that are not in inclusive settings. There's been certainly an increase in rigor for those applied students, and more complex labs are happening with their input and with their teaming. Yeah, basically, like the whole mood of the class has changed. And instead of 15-year-olds having a competition for who can be more silly, this had teacher reports, he's surrounded by 20 plus advocates taking their job seriously, and then 6 applied students engaged in class. And he calls it one of the most unique teaching experiences of his career. And I have an 8th grader who's going into high school, and like I'm trying to get my own 8th grader into this class, right? Intentionally through his IEP, but then also like I think that's the best place for him. So where I was at as a student, like I didn't think that the two would ever go together. Like I went to a private Catholic high school, and I don't even know that there was a separate room. I think there were just separate buildings. Like you didn't even get enrolled if you had certain accommodations that you needed in your IEP. And administrators were discouraging folks to be in that high school. Now, the high school I'm at, we are a public high school, so like inherently more inclusive there, but then also trying to break down barriers between classrooms and students that have existed throughout their middle school or more typically in other buildings. So that's how I've moved in my understanding. But I continue to learn, and like I don't know how good that is now, or I know that there's a lot more progress that I can make personally as a teacher and as a leader.
Thanks, John. It just sounds like I'll just say it sounds like anecdotally what that teacher is describing is that there are benefits for everyone when we are like when we have a space that supports everyone. Like that is a good thing for every single participant in that classroom. It's not creating a space where all students can learn together with the appropriate supports to be able to be challenged and have their needs met and be successful is not like a burden to any of those members of that classroom community. So that's just something I wanted to highlight.
Well, and I would also highlight, like, I don't think that teacher would feel morally okay going back, right? Like, whoa, what we've done this year and all of the good that has come out of that, like, why would we not do this again next year? Like, I think he would feel dirty to not do it more.
Mm-hmm. Alex or Jordyn?
I can go ahead. All right. I think when I think about my kind of previous, I think my previous schema of inclusion, it was a lot of what Teresa was talking about in the chat, just kind of the anachronistic ideal that exists. I definitely thought so much that disability and inclusion was really just proximity and presence, I think, is kind of how I thought about it. I tend to avoid alliteration sometimes because I feel like sometimes it's hackneyed, but I was like, I think proximity and presence actually works for this. Like, I really thought that that's what it was. And I thought if we could just bring everyone together, then we're really good. But I think the more that I've thought through it, I've really kind of winnowed it down to two ideals, which I think, in my mind, kind of semantically make up what disability inclusion is. And I think the first one is absolutely active engagement between all who exist within the space, I think is really important to me when I think about inclusion. And this showed up a lot in the research work that I had done kind of previously that was tied to the organization with the Nora Project as well. And I think that's also what I've found statistically has made the Nora Project programming so effective, is the fact that there's such an active engagement that's fostered. And it's not just like we're existing in the same space. And so that's what I found empirically and quantitatively really made an amazing difference that the organization can provide that others just can't. And two, I think another huge piece of inclusion to me is really intentionality regarding all who inhabit the space. But I think in particular, those who the space was designed for societally. So I think a lot about the idea of the space that neurotypical or able-bodied people take up. And I think that when we think about the idea of inclusion, ensuring that those individuals are also prepared to be an includer, an ally, co-conspirator, and an intentional member of that space that they inhabit, I think is really valuable too, because I don't think inclusion can actually reach its zenith without that. So I think so much of it too is making sure that those who are in the space don't just continue to exist in their own bubble, and thinking about the fact that even though identities, may intersect in places and may not in others, that, I don't know, I think that's something that I've really stuck on recently as well.
So essentially like making sure that all students are taught about all the different identities, including disability as an identity. Is that kind of what you're?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that, again, that's definitely, a direction obviously the Nora Project has gone as well recently too, about really focusing on the idea of disability being an identity. And the fact that and how that overlaps with other identities that exist within spaces and within individuals that people exist in. So I think absolutely. Yeah, I think I was like, I'm going to say more. No, absolutely. I think that's huge.
Yeah. Jordyn?
I used to think that inclusion wasn't for me or students like me. There's so much diversity within our community, but I didn't hear people talking about my needs in a way that matched the way they talk about inclusion. As a non-speaking autistic person with other medical needs, my support needs fluctuate, and I often needed, and still sometimes need, the assistance of others in order to stay regulated. That's all okay, but people didn't understand that to be okay at the time. Now I know and fiercely believe that every single student, and all humans, have a right to be meaningfully included. This absolutely includes me. It doesn't matter what services or supports a student needs. Inclusion allows those supports and services to seamlessly be a part of the environment in order for the student to experience success. I know when inclusion is done well, how students do something isn't as important as each student being held to the same outcome. For example, going off the equity comment from Alex, if I have the expectation that students will put their name on their paper, some students may write their name, some may use a stamper, some may color their name, but the outcome is that every student's paper has their name on it. That's a part of inclusion.
Thanks, Jordyn. And I think that, that kind of circles back really nicely to what John said about being intentional in your planning. And so ensuring that you know the students that you're working with, that you have taken the time to get to know their access needs and their support needs, and that you respect that fulfilling those needs is not doing that student a favor. It is instead creating a space for them to learn the way that everyone else gets to learn. So, just understanding that those accommodations are not doing a nice thing. That's a very charity focused model of thinking about disability. And what we encourage folks to do is to think about disability as a part of diversity that impacts the way that people show up in the world, just like any other part of diversity impacts the way that people show up in the world, and that all of those ways are equally good and fine and neutral. Any other thoughts? Or go ahead, John.
I just like to echo that teaching all of the students about the disability rights movement, I feel, is part of what inclusion should and could become. Indiana does not have what Illinois has in terms of like that piece of requirement that I understand to be relatively new. But I agree that like all the students should know about this, right? And it shouldn't be. I had an opportunity yesterday to like use the term disability when everybody was saying exceptional education, special education. It's like, hey, part of the Nora Project and part of like us, I feel moving forward, is confronting this discomfort to say disability and to talk about it as a civil rights movement and that type of identification of it. So like I said, I'm still growing in it, but I feel like continuing to push to have the broad population understand things more widely about it, and also it not then just be relying upon individual experiences that people have and conversations they have just within their family or talking about other families, but to have an educated person and organization to be able to like have this conversation at a school, I think is critical. Yeah.
Thanks, John. And I just want to lift up one of the things that you said, just to clarify for folks, that we as an organization train a lot, and Jordyn does a lot of training for folks on we encourage people not to use euphemisms for disability when they mean disability. So terms like special needs or other, sometimes we hear people say things like differently abled or exceptional students or whatever. We encourage you to say what you mean. And also along with that, if someone self-identifies using a certain term, you respect the way that they self-identify. We don't encourage anyone to tone police other folks. You can self-identify the way that you wish to, but we do encourage people to say the word disability because there's nothing bad about it. There's nothing tragic or scary or odd or unusual about it. 25% of people globally experience disability. And so it's not something that we shouldn't say. It's not something we should cover up with euphemisms.
And I think to that end, and I think so much about this, that so much of that is so valuable because of the fact that for lots of people, their lived experience might not allow them to understand the lived experience. And Jordyn kind of touched upon that as well, about the fact that she didn't have the support in spaces that she would have desired and wanted. And so I think that when people tend to, exist within their own space and kind of don't have those windows out into the world or don't have these conversations, it's really hard to help really change and adjust what we're doing. Because like we said, we're not where we need to be. That if these ideas feel radical, we're not where we need to be. And in order to engender change, I think that we need to be willing to, openly say disability and not whisper it or say that it's a bad word, because I don't think that we can actually feasibly support all forms of human diversity and identity without actually talking about them. And I think that's where the intersectionality piece comes in. I think that's applicable to gender identity and sexual orientation and race and ethnicity and country of origin too. So I think that's valuable. And my lights went off, so here we are.
I'm just quick to read the chat. John said natural form of human variation. Disability is a natural form of human variation. Any other thoughts from the panel or anyone in the chat? Okay. The next question I would like to pose to Alex. Oh, sorry, Jordyn. Jordyn says, yes, none of those things exist on parallel systems of oppression. They all intersect. Yes. Awesome. Thank you. So, Alex, what has your experience been with inclusive or exclusive settings as a learner? I want us to think for a moment about as our own experiences as a learner. So where does that fall for you?
So I thought about this a lot as a reverse commuter, as someone who commutes kind of out of the city and then back in. I have a lot of time to myself to think, and I thought about this for more than a week. And I realized that I didn't have the answer that I would have been looking for. And to me, that actually was my answer. That as I think about my experiences as a learner, and I was like, well, what did that look like? And I was like, I actually can't really recall what that looked like. And so to me, the fact that I have zero schema of that, of what inclusivity was as a learner, shows me the lack of integration that existed in terms of all aspects, like academically, socially. And so that also really tells me that the baseline for educational existence is often exclusion, is what I've come to realize. The fact that nobody really did anything outside of, anything related to anything close to what the Nora Project kind of, does and offers, and the things that, my class has the opportunity to do, that didn't exist, and these conversations didn't happen. And so I started to really feel like the spaces that I existed in as a learner were really just designed for some and not for all. And so I think that's the biggest paradigm shift that I'm starting to think about as I think about my experiences as a learner, and now as an educator, but then also a learner at the post-secondary level too, is the intentionality that needs to be put into designing spaces that are inclusive and accessible for all, because my experience as a learner did not reflect that.
Jordyn, do you want to go next?
I've had a vast array of experience both as a student and in my journey of completing my higher education degrees. As a younger student, I was frequently excluded from other non-disabled students, and those experiences really shaped my belief about inclusion. During my last year of high school, I was very intentionally included, both academically and socially. It was really challenging for me and for the school, but because of that, and because everyone was truly committed, my self-esteem grew, my intentional communication expanded, and my excitement for the future began. This meaningful inclusion provided me with some of the necessary skills to be ready for college and living on a campus with over 20,000 other students. Most recently, I student taught in a large urban district while obtaining my master's degree. I worked with students in a substantially separate environment. It was really difficult to be on the other side, engaging with students who could be included if provided with appropriate services and support, but not given access due to ableist barriers. So my experiences as a learner have been challenging, and I'm still learning.
Thanks, Jordyn. Go ahead, John.
I'm processing what Jordyn said, but also I think a lot of my experience was like Alex in terms of, I think a lot of my educational growing up was designed to try to exclude students who were as high achieving as myself from students who were disabled. And I think that at the time, and maybe still today, people want that exclusion, and they want to feel like their high achieving academic students are as efficiently taught as possible to try to get that separation academically for scholarship purposes, for academic excellence purposes. I think that is a lot of how I went through school systems, from being an honors English as a 7th grader and taking algebra as an 8th grader. And I don't know that there was, I mean, the system was designed to sort out and shift away people from each other. And a lot of the system that I teach in right now still has that as like their paradigm. And that's what the public appears to maybe want, in terms of, we're the highest out of district transfer into our corporation than any place else. And is it to try to get into our honors programs? I don't know that people are deciding to come into our program, our school, to be in more inclusive settings. It doesn't appear to be that is a decision-making thing, because we don't like advertise it a whole lot like we advertise the other stuff. So as a learner, I feel like most of my education was in exclusive settings. I also like played basketball, and we had an inclusive group of, like, with managers and statisticians and stuff. Like, that was a more inclusive group. But being in the athletic, competitive college sports scene, it wasn't. I did a lot of learning there, and it was exclusive. So that was my kind of lived experience as a student. And now feeling more responsible for 100% of kids in my classroom in my school, and looking at things not just from how successful the top slice is, but how successful everybody is. I feel like what I thought like was kind of like privilege for me to do, like, I kind of view as like, I was a jerk, right? Like, the words I said and used to describe students with disabilities, like, I never want my kids to ever say those words and to think those things. But I thought those things and said those words. And was it a function of how exclusive my educational tracking system was, and things that maybe teachers even told me and principals told me, and like the unwritten curriculum that was messaged through the system? Like, I don't want my kids to think those things, right? Like, so that's been the pivot, right, in terms of how I grew up and now what I'd like to see change. And I don't know, a lot of educators will say, like, oh, what goes around comes around, like the pendulum swings. I think I don't know of any time that we've ever been as try to be as intentionally inclusive as what we are now. And I hope that it's not like something that would try to swing back as we're making the slow progress and intentional progress to the Nora Project. From my understanding of history, this is just like a pendulum that's swinging slowly in the direction we hope that it should swing. But that's my experience.
Thanks, John. What you said, I think, relates earlier to something Alex mentioned about, like, who was the system built for, and who are the gatekeepers to the system. And Jordyn, I'd love it if you could speak to this, because I know you have more experience in this area of, there's the people in education that hold a lot of the power are primarily non-disabled people. At least from, I actually can't make that assumption, but what I can say is that it's based on the systems and structures that are upheld that do not support people with disabilities, students with disabilities, teachers with disabilities. It is clear that there's not a strong belief in most educational spaces that inclusion is that creating spaces where all kids are supported is something that is valued. And so I'll pause for Jordyn.
People making decisions about education, designing curriculum, building schools, deciding on master schedules, and leading classrooms most often do not have high support needs and are not representative of the needs of students. Until the system allows for more access of folks who have been most impacted by the harmful practices, things will not meaningfully change.
Thanks, Jordyn. Any other thoughts on this from the panel?
I guess a lot of the conversation just has me thinking about how much, I guess the issues really exist systemically, I think is so much of the conversation. And I think, trying to address that is challenging because I think anytime there's a system involved, I mean, obviously there are multifarious entry points. And so I think, I don't know, I feel like for me especially, I tend to get caught in the trap between like, what can I operationalize within my space, but then what can I attempt to do to dismantle this system that is designed for a specific segment of our country and our world? How can I try to dismantle a system that's really just set up for, cishet, white, able-bodied, neurotypical individuals? And I feel like sometimes maybe that starts within your own space. I mean, I feel like maybe as an educator, that's probably the best way to kind of move forward. But I feel like, yeah, so much of this conversation does has me thinking about the fact that there's a lot to this. And I think even though I've been involved in this work for 4 or 5 years at this point educationally, I still kind of struggle back and forth with where is the best place for me to exist, to be a co-conspirator in this work.
That it feels like a good place for a shameless plug. This summer, Jordyn is planning our training camp event. We train our teachers every year in order to prepare them to teach the curricular programs that we offer, but really the focus of training camp is on deepening people's understanding of disability as diversity and addressing content like what we're talking about today. And the theme of this year's training camp is spheres of influence, because as Alex was talking about, I think what we've heard from a lot of educators this year, and over the years, this has been clear to me in my own, teaching experience and whatnot, that teachers feel a lot of powerlessness to make changes in the system. And we lose track of what we can do to, what influence can we have? What do we have power to change? And so that is the theme of training camp this year. We have a killer lineup of folks, and I will drop a link to a blog post that we just put out into the chat that shares more about the folks that are going to be joining us for that event. We are, if you're not currently, working with us as a partner school, we are selling tickets to that event. So if that's something you're interested in, you can reach out to myself or to Jordyn, or you can buy those directly on our website. But we'd love to have as many folks as we can share in those conversations. Okay. Any other thoughts, panelists, before I open it up?
Looking at the question in the chat box.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank
that's
you.
what I was going to respond to. Yeah.
Go ahead.
How does one spread that out of your own space? That is where I think a lot of us struggle. Teresa said that. And in my head, it's like being in meetings where decisions get made and repeating what other people had said who maybe are not in the meeting, but like having a line or a quote or like asking, not rhetorically, but asking, like, I'll say the person's name. How would Amy Zimmer feel about this decision? Knowing that she is a strong advocate and ally, and that somebody who a lot of people respect. But it is like a slow game in many respects, but listening to those who are listened to by others and like trying to spread and continue talking. But I'll let Alex continue going too.
Yeah, I think for me, especially, so much of it being an elementary educator is I find the homeschool connection to be really valuable. That especially I teach in a community where I would say the parents are, a generation and a half older than me kind of at this point in my life. And so a lot of my experiences that I had growing up, they had that kind of multiplied. So much of what I do is I tend to share a lot of what we do within the classroom at home. And it fosters those conversations at home. And I've been told that, like, oh, then, the grandparents came over and then, like, now we had the conversation, or like we donated to the organization, or we're going to go to this fundraiser back when those things happened in person. And so I think a lot of it too is the fact that, within my space, I'm like, it's not just my 22 kids, like they have families and their families have friends. And so these conversations are happening in ways that, parents would engage with me and saying that, like, we never talked about disability at home before, and now, like, that's something that's come up, like at a family party where, now our entire family is having conversations about what disability looks like in the spaces that they inhabited in ways that they didn't. I think is a huge part of what I like to do. And I think with my students as well, that I try to have the long play, which is really hard, I think, as an educator, that, we try to do everything possible and be like, okay, like when you leave this room, you're going to have it all. And it's like, that's not necessarily true. I try to avoid like that specious trap, I feel like. And a student who started with me in my first year of the Nora Project, when they graduated from our school this year, so they wanted to be a special education teacher. And it's from someone who has two parents that are attorneys. And I think when I was going into 7th grade, I had no idea what that role was. And even if that, teacher, even if that student doesn't decide to do that, I feel like the fact that they're able to, as they move forward in their life, have this lens in which they're viewing the world. Especially I teach in a community that's relatively privileged and is relatively high achieving in terms of test scores. And I'm thinking these are going to be, children who become adults who are in positions of power. And so, like, for them to be able to be working in spaces where their voice is heard, but they have this lens of that they've developed over the years, is something that I think too, and I think long term of what this looks like. So I think those are the two pieces that allow me to sleep at night, I suppose, assuming that those are working the way that I'd like them to.
I've been working under the hypothesis that by being great in my own space would help to legitimize efforts outside of my space. So that means doing my job every day as best I can, and going for recognitions so that way I can try to make the change in places where I want to make the changes at. Because you'll see a lot of awards behind my name on the internet. And that's really just so that I can, like, hey, look, let's do this. Why are we not doing this? Why are we not doing this? Why are we not doing this? And then understanding that administrators don't want to hear about that all the time, these other things. And that's on them to have to sleep with. If they don't want to do something that one of their teachers who has won a number of awards doesn't want to do, that's them. Like, that's administrators who don't want to do that. But I'll sleep well at night knowing that I've communicated up the chain and done everything I can, and know that another day, another opportunity to advocate and do as best we can. But just thinking about what Alex had said and building off of
that. Lindsay put in the chat, it's the ripple effect that makes education so powerful. Something that I think is helpful and is just asking questions. And Jordyn is, like, actually really, really good at that. And so I'm learning even more how to use that as a strategy to get people to pause. And, you don't have to ask a question that is, it allows you to get people to think about things without demanding something, or, Jordyn, especially when I don't like something. You do have a pattern. But it's super helpful because, I know from experience that sometimes working in a school, there are power dynamics that feel uncomfortable, even if you have tenure and there's very little that can be done, to, like, affect your job security or whatever. People can make your life miserable. That's a thing. We know that that's how schools work, right? And so we all have to navigate power dynamics in our own spaces. And so I think that asking questions thoughtfully and strategically can be a good way to start moving conversations in a good direction, at least to get people to stop and be like, ooh, I don't have an answer for that I want to say out loud. And so that is something I need to think about more. Any other questions from our audience? All right. Well, Lindsay, I'll let you go ahead and close us, but we'll stick around. Of course, if more questions come in, please don't hesitate to drop them in the chat. And also, we'll drop the contact information sheet again in the chat so that folks can access that if you would like to contact us further. We're very grateful for your time today.
Thank you all so much. I just so appreciate the honest and vulnerable conversations and making this a safe space to continue learning, to continue growing. And I know we all feel like we have a lot of work to do on ourselves, but it's good work, it's future work. And we're all moving in the right direction because of organizations like the Nora Project, because of teachers like you, John and Alex, who are, like you said, doing the best you can on a daily basis to set that example, not just for your students and their families, but for your peers and your fellow teachers as well. And the fact that you all took the time today out of your busy schedules to come and share with us is super impactful, and we're forever grateful for that.